It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't let up, pouring down endlessly and making a racket that seemed to try to smother us in unease. I was at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place you'd only stop at if you absolutely needed fuel or were desperate to get out of the storm. The attendant was out there, wearing a raincoat that looked more like a rag than anything that could actually keep him dry. While he was filling up my tank, I started feeling this weird discomfort. I don't know if it was the relentless rain or the fact that I was alone at this remote station, but something was definitely off. The attendant was acting strange. He kept looking over his shoulder, and every time he went to the back of the store, it seemed like he was trying to hide something. I could hear muffled, weird noises coming from back there, like he was messing with something he shouldn't be. The feeling that something was wrong just kept growing. I was leaning against the counter, trying to ignore the chill that seeped through my clothes and the growing sense that the night was getting creepier by the minute. I was starting to think I was imagining things when a car pulled up beside mine. It was one of those old, beat-up vehicles that looked like it had seen better days. The guy who got out of the car was exactly what you'd expect, a sketchy character with a worn-out jacket and a shifty look. He seemed like he knew exactly what he was doing and had no interest in following any unspoken rules of civility. As soon as he walked into the store, the attendant completely changed. The guy looked like he'd seen a ghost. He got even more nervous, as if he was trying to avoid a crisis. They exchanged glances and some words, but I couldn't quite make out what was being said. The attendant, already acting weird, now seemed like he was trying to hide from the guy, but in a strange way. The tension was thick, and I could feel the weight of what was happening. Every time the guy went to the back of the store, the attendant followed him like a trained dog, always looking anxious. I started to realize that their interaction wasn't normal. Something shady was going on, and I wasn't liking what I was seeing one bit. As the minutes ticked by, the tension kept mounting. The attendant looked more and more worried, and the guy was acting like he was there to make a big deal. I started to notice that the exchanges and movements in the back of the store weren't just for show. The attendant and the guy were clearly involved in something shady. The attendant was handling documents and other items that clearly didn't belong there. From what I could see, the guy was receiving something of value from the attendant, something that seemed more than just cash. It was like they were making a secret deal, a scheme to sell personal information. I got chills. The reality of what was happening hit me hard. The attendant was handing over personal data to the guy, and this wasn't just a simple case of corruption, it was a data trafficking scheme. They were trading personal information, selling people's privacy to a shady market. My heart was racing, and the feeling that I was in a very dangerous place only grew stronger. There was no way I was staying there to see how this would play out. With one last nervous glance at the attendant and the guy, I decided it was best to get the hell out of there before things got even worse.
I was driving home after a long day and decided to stop at this gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was the only station on the deserted road, with flickering lights and a sign that looked like it had seen better days. The place was nearly empty, and the only other vehicle besides mine was a rusty old truck. I walk into the store, and the cashier, a guy named Dave, was behind the counter. He was your typical gas station worker, looking a bit worn out, and with a stare that said he'd rather be anywhere else. He greeted me with a quick, half-hearted, "Good night," almost like he was half asleep. I pay, grab my change, and start to head out. The register was visibly empty, which was odd, but nothing that really alarmed me at the time. Dave gives me a wave and a, "Have a good night." I head back to my car, only to realize that the register was completely empty. Weird, I thought. Maybe he was just off to the bathroom or something. I glanced back at the store and saw him heading towards the back, so I figured he'd be back soon. But minutes ticked by with no sign of him. An uneasy feeling started to creep in. With the gas station deserted and that absolute silence, the sense that something wasn't right began to gnaw at me. I decided to go back into the store to see what was going on. When I walked back in, a heavy silence enveloped me. It felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. The place was so quiet I could hear every step I took. I called out for Dave, but the only sound that echoed back was my own voice. I went to the bathroom at the back and knocked on the door. "Dave? Are you in there?" Nothing. I started to get the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The bathroom was locked, and there was no sign of Dave. The store was perfectly neat, and everything seemed normal, except for the fact that the employee was just gone. The wall clock seemed to be ticking in slow motion. With every passing minute, I felt more frustrated and anxious. I thought about calling the cops, but before I did, I decided to check the storage area behind the counter. Nothing there either. I wondered if he was just taking a break and would be back soon, but my patience was running thin. I decided I had to do something. I picked up the phone to call 911, but to my frustration, I was put on hold for what felt like an eternity. I started to feel a mix of anger and anxiety. The place was so quiet I could even hear my own heartbeat. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the police arrived. The relief was quickly replaced by a new wave of nervousness. I explained the situation, and they started to search the station. The place looked exactly the same, except for Dave's absence. They checked every corner, including the bathroom, but found nothing but an empty and well-organized store. I was trying to figure out what was going on. The police asked a few questions and started their investigation, but they didn't find any concrete leads. There were no signs of a struggle or anything indicating that something was wrong. It seemed like Dave had just vanished. The idea of a sudden and unexplained disappearance was really freaking me out. In the end, the cops said it could be a sudden escape or even something personal. There was no evidence of a crime, just a gas station employee who vanished into thin air. I had the sense that something was seriously wrong, but with no answers. I never heard anything more about Dave, and the station continued to operate as usual.
I was starving and honestly, too damn tired to keep driving. I decided to stop at one of those roadside convenience stores, the kind that pops up out of nowhere. I went into the store and headed straight for the snack aisle, grabbed some random stuff and went up to the register. The clerk was there, looking like he was going through hell. The guy seemed completely out of place, like he was battling some internal war. His eyes were fixed on the counter, and I could swear his hands were shaking a bit as he counted out my change. I was about to leave when I decided to take one last look around the store. Something was bothering me. When I walked out and headed to the parking lot, the darkness around was almost tangible. But what really grabbed my attention was the group of people hanging out in the shadows. There were maybe 5 or 6 of them, clustered together, not doing anything particularly weird. They just seemed to be standing around, like they were waiting for something. The way they moved, like they were trying to hide, gave me chills. I couldn't make out any details, but the feeling of unease was thick. It was like an internal alarm had gone off. I got back to the car, trying not to dwell too much on what I'd seen. As I drove away, an uneasy feeling took over. The group in the parking lot kept haunting my thoughts, and the nervous clerk seemed like a piece of a puzzle I couldn't fit together. When I finally arrived at the cheap motel where I planned to spend the night, the tension felt crushing. I tried to relax and distract myself, but every time I looked out the motel room window, there they were. The same group, back in the parking lot, exactly where I'd seen them before. Now they were moving around more purposefully, going back and forth. They looked visibly agitated, like they were waiting for something or someone. My mind was spinning. The situation seemed absurd, but the feeling of danger was real. My stomach was in knots, and I wondered if I should call the cops, but what would I say? That I saw a group of people in a motel parking lot and felt uncomfortable? I wasn't sure if it was paranoia or if something was genuinely wrong, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. When the sun finally came up, the group had vanished, and the motel seemed calm and normal. The clerk from the convenience store was back, behind the counter, with a friendly smile. It looked like nothing had happened. The normalcy of the morning made me feel a bit foolish for being so anxious. Life went on, and I tried to convince myself that I'd overreacted. But the feeling of discomfort didn't go away. I still wondered what really happened that night. What was that group up to? And why did the clerk seem so nervous? Nothing made sense, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might have actually occurred.
Subscribe if you liked our content